My name is your host. In New York City today, the weather is expected, the temperature is expected to max out at 95 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 35 degrees Celsius. And if you think that's hot, then spare a thought for the folks in Phoenix, Arizona, where it's expected to be 115 degrees Fahrenheit. It's about 46 degrees Celsius. Yet another day. There's been a string of days like this. If this sounds like a weather report, there's a reason for that. We're here to talk precisely about abnormal weather, or perhaps this is the new normal weather. Extreme heat across pretty much atmosphere and indeed parts of the South. And I'm joined today to talk about this by my colleagues also in New York, Rachel Rosenthal, who's a member of the Bloomberg Opinion Board, and Mark Gongloff, who's our climate writer. Rachel and Mark, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Rachel, I'm going to start with you. Could you just sort of set the table a little bit by explaining the new buzzword that's around this year about the extreme heat? What is a heat dome?
Yeah, it sounds apocalyptic, and I got to geek out a little bit on the meteorology here for reporting on this topic, and it didn't make it all into the editorial, but I think it is pretty interesting. So the what's been happening is, thanks to in great part thanks to climate change, the oceans have been warming, which has been changing the wind patterns. The wind patterns have thus changed the jet stream, and that what normally is sort of a wavy band has become even wider, and that's creating these like areas of high pressure in the atmosphere. And what ends up happening is that the air that traps hot air underneath it, and the hot air then, as it's sinking, pushes out, sort of expunges any sort of cooling rainstorms, and then the air hits the ground, which is baking from the sun, and starts rising again, and so you've got this sort of circular effect. And so what it's called is a heat dome, and these are, as you've mentioned, over large areas, not only of the US but Europe and parts of Asia as well. So there are some maps online which are pretty terrifying.
Yeah, terrifying is about right, Mark. Across the world, we've seen this insanely hot temperatures this year. You just wrote a column about the impact on cities, and we'll unpack that a little bit in a moment. But I was arrested by the point you made right at the top. You said this is probably going to be the hottest year on record. But if you next few years to come, this may be the coolest year going forward. Now that is genuinely terrifying.
Yeah. You used the term new normal in your intro, and I think we have to understand that this isn't necessarily a new normal. This could be just a ramping up on the way to some new normal, and the new normal will keep shifting and keep getting worse the more we keep pumping carbon into the atmosphere and keep warming the atmosphere. So we are rising. The heat is rising. It's hot as it's ever been. It's a little bit influenced this year by El Nino, so we may set, and we can talk about that more. It's a little bit influenced this year by El Nino, but the heat in the U.S. that we're seeing is not so much being influenced by El Nino. It is part of a pattern. El Nino usually tends to actually kind of cool many parts of the U.S. And instead, what we're seeing is record heat in at least half the U.S. and smashing records in places like Phoenix, where they've had a month of temperatures of 110 degrees Fahrenheit and above, which is just unbelievable and almost unlivable. And yes, this is just part of a trend of warming, and as long as that trend continues, then these heat waves will get more intense.
And of course, this much more in urban areas, Rachel. And so I'll ask you to explain another term that you've used, which is heat island. What are those, and what causes them to?
Sure. I think any among our listeners who've spent time in a city during a hot day can sort of already probably naturally understand what it is. The vast amounts of concrete and tall buildings, and this all absorbs the heat and traps it, and it can be as much as 15 to 20 degrees hotter in some of these areas than it is in shady areas in the same city, but particularly out in rural areas. So that's not to diminish, there's obviously it's a struggle in rural areas too if there's not access to water and other cooling areas, but it can be particularly dangerous in cities for the elderly, for the young, pregnant women, but also low-income populations that may not have access to AC, and even non-English speakers who might not be able to track what's happening in the news as easily.
And Mark, if this is going to be, as we've said, if this is going to be the new normal, if things are likely to get progressively worse, do we have to rethink the existence of cities like Phoenix? I mean, are places like Phoenix doomed to become unlivable?
I think we have to at least Phoenix is taking measures to address the heat. It's actually fairly progressive in how it's treating heat. It's uh, putting special coating on it so that it reflects heat, and it's trying to do everything it can, setting up cooling centers, stuff like that. But people are still dying, and dying by the dozens, dying by the hundreds every year. And there, you reach a certain point where adaptation isn't enough. And I don't know, Phoenix has 4.5 million people and it's growing. It's the fastest growing city in the US right now, unbelievably. Um, that has to change. We at least have to start to uh, test to find some limits to this kind of growth in places like this. And Phoenix is starting to do that because they're not going to have enough water to serve all the people that want to move in there. And so it may never be completely uninhabited, but we will really have to rethink how we resettle these places. We need to spend a lot more time and thought and energy on adaptation. And of course, I have to make this point again and again and again. We have to keep trying to do everything we can to stop burning fossil fuels as quickly as we can, to stop making the problem even worse.
Just staying with you, Mark. I mean, it's a big ask to an entire belt of the country where there are many cities that are actually growing very fast. Um, you know, it seems like we're a long way from the political will for that kind.
Yeah, it's going to be messy. I mean, right now it is messy as we speak. I mean, these places, some of the places where people are that are growing the fastest in this country are places like Florida, Arizona, Texas, that are subject to heat waves, droughts,
Yeah.
floods, hurricanes. They are right on the front lines of the changing climate, and many of them are becoming uninsurable. California is another example. Places on the sort of urban wildlife interface are becoming uninsurable because they're constantly, the houses are burning down, or in Florida they're constantly getting wiped out by hurricanes. And so what you're seeing is middle class people who have come to these places seeking lower costs of living, are now stuck with, I can't get my home insured. And so it gets to, or I can't get my home rebuilt in a way that is wildfire proof or hurricane proof, because it's very expensive to do that. And so what you are kind of seeing, at least right now, is you're seeing this sort of messy middle where people who can afford this will keep rebuilding there, and the other people see who sought out a lower cost of living are having to leave. And then we also are stuck with the idea of how many times do we rebuild these houses for people?
Yeah.
How often do we send rescue workers in to rescue people who are building in these on the bleeding edge of where it's livable? And so this will be solved for us one way or the other. Places will just become uninhabitable, and we can do it the hard way or the easy way. And there are no easy ways, actually. The
Yeah.
one easy way would be the government's buying people out and resettling them elsewhere. But as you say, the political will for that is it's unthinkable in this country right now, and also the expense of it. Um, so it's difficult. There are no easy answers to it.
And Rachel, we're paying a lot of attention to Phoenix. There's been a lot of reporting about the American South, which is experiencing these enormous, which is and feeling it particularly. But you and I have lived in where heat is a daily occurrence. Singapore, southern India, um, parts of much of Africa, but there too, people are used to being hot. It's getting hotter and hotter. But cities there have had a longer experience of this kind. Are there best practices? Are there things that cities elsewhere in the world are doing that would make sense for Phoenix to do and
Yeah,
for Miami
sure.
and other places?
Those are excellent points, Bobby. And, having just moved back from Singapore about a year ago and Hong Kong, where I was living for several years, some of what the numbers that we're seeing, you wouldn't even blink an eye in parts of India and parts of the
Yes.
equatorial Asia. And cities have adapted, and I'll explain that in a minute. But I think what's sort of underappreciated is how people also adapt. One of the German health ministers kind of got a lot of press, maybe it was last week, for recommending a siesta, like a Spanish style siesta. But this is actually sort of pretty natural in other parts of the world where, maybe you get up earlier or maybe you don't. But, there's this sort of, no sensible person goes out in the middle of the day in Singapore, and so it sort of requires rethinking some of the common sense things. And there's sort of this American mentality, well, we just have to like sort of barrel through and keep our lives going as is, and that's what's going to kill people. If you continue to live your life as if everything is still normal, you could get sick and you could even die. There are terrible stories of people working through all kinds of really hot conditions. And you not only have to look at the temperature, but we've mentioned the heat index, even the wet bulb temperature, which is a term, that also takes into account, direct sun exposure. So that's particularly important for outdoor workers. I could, just being at a 90 degrees, which is 32 Celsius, would be dangerous for outdoor workers in certain for when you're thinking about wet bulb temperature. So you have to like guys gotta keep like this whole dictionary of terms in your head. So that's what people can do or take into their own hands. But to your question on things that cities can do, yeah, cities has started planting grass on top of bus stops, just to be able to absorb the heat. I think there's new technologies with paint that can be reflective, white paint. I mean, if you also look at civilizations around the world, some of their architecture. Singapore has very low buildings that increases airflow. So there are adaptations that, it will be hard for New York City to replicate all of them, with all these
Yeah.
buildings that have already been put up. But there are ways to think about sort of changing behaviors, modifying cities to be able to better cope.
Mark, what are I mean, do you have thoughts on some of the ways that places like New York, where there is already this in population, what practical things can we do to, beyond pointed out, Phoenix was using reflective paint or reflective tarmac on the streets. What are some other things that can be done?
Well, I think, ironically, one thing that we need to do is make sure that people have adequate air conditioning. I mean, as somebody who wants to be more fuel efficient, it pains me to say that, but you have to keep people alive, and people. It's sort of a human right when the wet bulb temperatures are unsurvivable, no matter where we are in New York or in India or in anywhere, Arizona, to keep people alive. And so doing that efficiently, finding ways to uh, to keep people alive without burning as much fossil fuel as we typically do would be important. Just being empathetic to people, I think, is another issue. Rachel was talking about changing behaviors and changing attitudes, and you see that in Arizona. We're building out with this sprawl, this typical sort of suburban sprawl that you might see in Missouri or anywhere, and maybe we do really have to rethink how we settle places like this. And in Texas, the legislature just outlawed a requirement that companies give outdoor workers, heat and shade breaks. That seems completely destructive to me. We should at least give people, maybe not, if we're not going to give them siestas, we should at least allow them water and shade. And so there do still seem to be, there are, there are technological fixes, white paint on roofs and that sort of thing, grass, trees. Uh, Although there are also some studies that suggest sometimes the trees can have mixed effects on heat. But in any event, there are small fixes that we can make to, and especially in New York, maybe not have so many cars going into the city. It's a controversial topic, but New Jersey is suing New York over congestion pricing. But doing something to limit the amount of cars, doing something to make it more pedestrian friendly, these fixes are all available to us, but at root there is sort of we need to have a mindset that is prepared for heat to be a constant presence, and we don't really have that right now.
And of course, Rachel, you pointed out some of the health need. That puts sort of pressure on healthcare, on hospital systems in big cities, hospital systems that were designed uh, for certain climate conditions, and therefore for certain kinds of ailments that were common in those climate conditions. As the climate conditions change, the hospitals will have to change as well, and
Sure.
be that requires enormous investment, requires policymakers to step up.
Right. It's even, I mean, going to be a question of reimbursement. I read an article calling for doctors to be able to prescribe things like air conditioning, and that just
Oh
seems
wow.
like really sort of wonky. But it does, and Mark brings up an excellent point about, and some of our fellow columnists have written just about how damaging AC can be to the environment, and it just becomes this like self-perpetuating vicious cycle. But it is keeping folks alive. So, at this current time, one of the most dangerous health effects is heat stroke, which can be fatal and is often fatal. And it's basically when your body loses the ability to cool itself down. And so, you've got folks in Phoenix who are literally taking body bags, shoving them full of ice, and zipping people up inside them. People are dying just from the burns from the asphalt, which can reach 180 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, so you've got, so you're going to have to rethink medical care. I don't know how sustainable it is to just like shove everyone into a body bag full of ice, and particularly if water is scarce and ice, and even I'm sure,
Yeah.
that raises all kinds of other questions about how you'd be able to maintain those types of supplies. But certainly this is going to add pressure to an already very strained healthcare system.
You talked, Mark, about the the thing in Texas where they struck a law or a rule, I forget what, that required companies to give people breaks and provide them with water if they're working outdoors. It speaks to a political part of the political culture that continues to deny climate change. And ironic place in the American South, where the pressures of climate change are arguably the greatest, especially now in the summer. Anything pointing to a change in that political attitude? I mean, if you are a politician in the American South now who's trying to deny climate, you get away with it. Then your voters surely are feeling the effects, and will push back against that kind of assertion.
I wish I could be more optimistic about this after being so pessimistic throughout this whole call. But there's Bloomberg has a story today about how Republicans in Congress, people from Texas, John Cornyn, people like that, are you know the attitude has changed. No longer do we deny climate change, but no longer do they deny climate change, but instead they argue that we can't do anything about it too quickly. They question whether. So, for example, just this week, there's this. It's not a peer-reviewed study, but these people who routinely study the effects of climate change on weather patterns and weather disasters came out and said that the heat waves we're seeing right now around the world, the heat domes around the world, wouldn't have happened without climate change. And I think that feels obvious, but they have done studies that suggest that that's the case. Republicans in Congress are saying, well, let's not go so fast. Let's not talk about it. We don't know for sure. And of course, we don't know 100% for sure that any particular tornado or heat wave or hurricane is caused by climate change, but we can see the pattern, we can see the trends. And so there's this pushback still, no matter what's going on, there's still this pushback against doing anything too quickly. We still want to rely on fossil fuels. We still seek energy independence. We still seek, we claim that it is cleaner and more efficient to use American natural gas than, say Saudi oil, which, that sounds like a reasonable argument. But all of this stuff is slowing us down on the path that we need to be going much more quickly. And so it's not outright climate denialism, although you will still see that on Twitter or in my inbox after I read a column. But for the most part, climate denialism is pretty dead as a political force, but there's this different sort of climate sort of delayism that is still very powerful.
Just to build on that, though, sorry, and not to cut in, but I think the Biden administration today is going to announce certain or an attempt to make a federal standard to protect workers against the heat. And as I was digging into some of this, I was the lack of protections there are in any sort of federal way, and just how complex this is, because you run up against a business lobby, and of course, this seems so obvious: give workers breaks and let them drink water. I think in practice it does become more complex, and the rulemaking body OSHA. I mean, it can take as long as 19 years to develop a rule, and so the average is 7. So this is what makes your brain just explode. When we've got people dying and it's going to take another 7 years to make a rule. So I'm hopeful that the Biden administration has some answers for this, but I think it will take some will in Congress.
Well, to try and put myself in the shoes of the Republicans in places like Texas who are opposed to this, I will try, hard as it is. But perhaps, we don't need legislation for this. Companies, you don't need the government to tell you to give people a break. Tells you that if you don't give people a break, that hurts your business if they start collapsing on the factory floor or on the construction site. Is that an argument? Can that argument be sustained, Mark?
Not for a long time, not over the vast entire universe of businesses, because there will always be of course there will be people who will treat their workers well, but we can't rely on that. And the same thing, you raised this point about government help and the market taking care of all this stuff. I mean, there's also that argument that the market will take care of what we need to do to stop burning fossil fuels, to get more energy efficient. And to some degree, that is true. But then you look at examples like Tesla, which relied heavily on government loans, and today and other handouts over its life, and today is the biggest car maker in the world. Now it's a big capitalist success story, but it got a huge leg up from government. And so I think the scale of this problem is something that will require sort of a whole of society approach. We can't wait for the invisible hand of the market to fix any of this stuff for us. Government will have to be involved at every step, including protecting workers. And OSHA, Joe Biden actually told OSHA 2 years ago, to Rachel's point, he told them 2 years ago to come up with rules to protect workers. It's not that complicated. They still haven't done it. So maybe we're only 5 years away, but again, these workers don't have 5 years to wait.
Yeah, Rachel, you were nodding.
Yeah, no, I just, because we have a lot of these debates about what the role of the markets versus regulators should be. And, I guess the one peril of the market-based framework is, you have to wait for people to die to make that point and to sort of give those arguments ballast. And I think that's a high price to pay. And, it feels it feels better to say, let's make rules to prevent these things from happening. I know in reality it is probably much more complex. So maybe there needs to be, maybe we need to empower, should there be a broad federal standard that can be delve into more specifics or region-based or business-based, specifics and give flexibilities to businesses. I'm not sure. I'll have to, dig more into what that could look like. But I think there does need to be some sort of balance between those two forces of the markets and regulators here.
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking about the political atmosphere around this. We've been talking about the aspects, what companies can and ought to do, how cities ought to be preparing for this. But collectively, what it brings me to mind is this piece that our colleague David Fisher weeks ago, which is that, you know, to to a large extent, entire civilization as a species was designed for a different set of climate conditions, was not designed for this kind of climate. And so it's not just about legislation and it's about how we behave, our mores as people, as societies. Were not designed for this kind of thing. I'm sorry to go on a little bit, but it struck me that there was because I write so much about countries that are almost permanently under some sort of a heat dome, it would appear. There was a video that went viral yesterday from Tunisia, and security people pushing who were trying to get to the Mediterranean and cross over, pushing them back into the desert, into the Sahara. So they had to go back south. And there was this one particularly powerful video of a baby in her hands being sent back into the desert. Are we really ready? Are our moral structure ready for this kind of climate, Rachel?
Okay. I was hoping you would pass that big awesome question to Mark, who's much
me.
better equipped to
Mark
handle
has
it.
that thing too.
But I think the short answer is, our bodies are not adapted to a lot of the ways that we live right now. Just think about how we sit at our desks constantly, which has affected the way we eat, the way we sleep. And so I think now that we're becoming smart enough to recognize that no, our bodies are not equipped to deal with these kinds of conditions, be they working conditions or just general living conditions or temperature, we need to think about ways to change the way we, behave day to day. And I personally, I've changed the way I eat because I've noticed that when I sit for long periods, there are certain things that make me feel better or worse, and I think we have an obesity epidemic, so not to go too far off topic, but, there are things that we need to rely on the government to do. There are things that we can empower ourselves to do. And there are things that, we need to be able to press policymakers for, again, to come back to populations that are at risk, low-income folks who don't have as many choices. Some of us can make choices. We have the liberty to do that. We have the luxury to do that. Some people can't.
Mark?
Yep. Yeah, Bobby. When Rachel was talking about this and you asked this question, I mean, it used to be the issue with climate change, with thinking about climate change, was that we had to be kind to our future selves, right? We were like, well, this is going to be a problem in 2050, and so we've got to worry about future generations. And you can't. It's very difficult to make people today care about future generations. Well, the issue now is that the emergency is now, right? There's refugees are fleeing areas that are on fire or don't have sufficient food or water. They're fleeing those places right now, and they're being shoved back into the desert. To pick on Texas again, they're pushing children into the river. Horrible things, and we don't and that it really is testing, yes, not only our physiologies but also our morals, our ability to care for each other as human beings, and and again, this is about as good as it's going to get for a while, and so that will continue to be tested. And I mean, I guess to try to end on a somewhat optimistic note, I mean, there are some signs that that having this stuff in our faces is changing public attitudes about this as a topic, about this as a real emergency that needs real action. And I hope too that as we experience this, I mean, unfortunately, maybe it takes this as we get smoke in our faces from wildfires in Canada, or we feel the 120-degree heat, that suddenly we might have a little bit more empathy for the people who are fleeing those conditions and worse, and or who need our help even in our cities, who aren't fleeing it, but who need our help in the city where we live. Maybe that will change our attitudes. I mean, not to be too Pollyannish about it. We'll
Listen,
see how that does.
on a topic like this, I will take any shred of optimism anybody can offer, and
Yeah.
I'm grateful that we can end on that note. Mark Gongloff and Rachel Rosenthal, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having
And
us.
thanks to all our viewers and listeners. I hope you got as much as I did out of that conversation as us. And please go to bloomberg.com/opinion to read Mark and Rachel and all of our columnists. We publish a lot of pieces about climate change, particularly sort of because it's so much on the news, but also because we've got lots of really smart people applying there. And we write about a wide range of other issues from all over the world, and there's and learn from the website. And please also come back. We do these live streams and Twitter Spaces every day on a wide range of topics. @opinion is our handle on Twitter or X, and find out upcoming conversations. Thank you again very much for joining us, and come back. Meanwhile, stay cool. Goodbye.